Welcome, everyone. This is Margaret Smith, the Executive Director of the Trumpeter Swan Society, and I want to welcome you to our webinar today about Yellowstone's iconic bird, the trumpeter swan. Before we get started, a couple of housekeeping details. You are muted and your video is off. We love to have your questions, and we will have those answered at the end. And if you have questions as the webinar is going on, just put them in the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen, and we'll try to get to as many of them as we can at the end of the webinar. Also, at the end of the webinar, as you're closing out, there will be a brief survey that'll pop up, and I hope you will fill that in. It's very brief. We want to know if you learned anything new and interesting or fun, and if you any other topics that you want to learn about through future webinars. And the recording of this will be available through Zoom to everyone who registered, and it'll come to you in a couple of days once I have a chance to upload it to YouTube. Before we get started on the webinar, I want to introduce a couple of Trumpeter Swan Society people behind the scenes. So Trumpeter Swan Society folks, if you want to put on your videos, that would be great. We have Jeff Nelson. I'll come back to you in a little bit, Jeff. Marianne Coughlin, who will be answering or asking the swan questions that you put into the Q&A box. Jim Hawkins from the Yukon, and Tiffany Mayo from Cleveland. And Jeff is our board chair. And Jeff, do you want to give a brief summary of some of the things that the Trumpeter Swan Society does?
Sure. Thanks, Margaret. And thanks to everyone for attending. Trumpeter Swan Society is a relatively small organization, but we've been around for over 50 years now, with a focus really on restoring trumpeter swans to their historic range in North America. We do a variety of things, but just briefly, we started off with mostly focused on restoration of populations, some pretty on-the-ground work. And now, more recently, as trumpeter swan populations have started to expand, we're funding research and continuing to fund areas where the swan is still struggling to get reestablished. So in addition to that, we do these kinds of things, webinars, to try to make sure our members and others are up to speed on what's going on with swans. Do a lot of outreach with education programs and that sort of thing. Films, coloring books for kids, working with the zoos that Tiffany's led that effort for us. We also monitor what's going on with swans with regard to lead poisoning issues and power line collisions. And every now and then we do take a position usually with other partners on advocacy positions having to do with issues that really affect the future of trumpeter swans. And oftentimes that's with other bird groups. So do a lot of different things. It's a small organization, but we think fairly effective. And again, I'd like to thank you for joining us today.
Thank you. And if anyone is interested in helping support our work, we'd love to have you become a member and be part of this great story of trumpeter swans. Now, I'd like to welcome our speakers. I'm delighted to have them here. There's David Haynes and Doug Smith. Both are from the National Park Service, and Doug retired somewhat recently, and he was responsible for a bunch of different animals, including birds and trumpeter swans. And after his retirement, Dave took over, and Dave will be the person giving the presentation. And it's just a delight to have you here. I'm just really thrilled to have you here. So Dave, do you want to take it away?
Sure. Thank you for having me. Let me get some stuff out of the way here real quick. Okay, hold on. Okay, so yeah, thank you for having me. First, I want to give you a little bit of background. I've been associated with the Yellowstone Bird Program now for I'm actually entering my 14th year. Well, it kind of surprises me a little bit. I came in under Doug Smith, primarily working with raptors initially. And in the last, just in the last few years, I took on a biologist position with the bird program. Doug retired, and then I moved into this current lead position with the bird program. And so I feel very fortunate to have moved into this place in my career and stuff. So before I kind of get into this, I wanted to first point out a couple people. I have a couple logos I have here at the bottom of the screen. The bottom left there, you can see Yellowstone Forever. This is our our nonprofit education and outreach and philanthropic organization that we work closely with that has done a lot for a lot of our swan work that we do here in the park. I also want to point out the Wyoming Wetlands Society, who's played a very strong role in the management we put forth that I will be talking about today. And you know, our host today, Trumpeter Swan Society, has also been a part of our work here, has in part funded some of the research, which I will also touch on a little bit as well. So I just wanted to point those out, these people and get forward. And actually the last thing I want to say is that for everything that I covered today, most of everything I covered today is in a book that we just had released last October. It's Yellowstone Birds, Diversity and Abundance in the World's First National Park. And so if anything that isn't, like I say, clear, the way I describe it, most of this story is much more eloquently written by Doug Smith himself. He's the lead author on the Swan chapter itself. There's many authors of many kinds of birds that we cover in here, whether it be research or just general knowledge about birds. So as I said, something that you guys might want to keep in mind if you have questions that I just don't seem to cover when it comes to trumpeter swan. So with that, let's get going here. Just get myself out of the way. Okay. So here. So I think, you know, many people here probably have some, you know, good background on the history of trumpeter swans, but I think we kind of need to start here at least. And so not taking into consideration the current set of trumpeter swans, they were really considered a very abundant species across North America historically. However, by the early 20th century, the species was reaching near extinction, and this was due to subsistence hunting for the meat. The feathers were commonly used as quills, as riding quills. And I put this James Audubon image here on the right because he's famously quoted for remarking that the quill of a trumpeter swan was by far better than any modern steel pen of its time. The skins of these birds were used for powder puffs, and in general, you know, wetlands, I think for a long time, maybe even some places today, were kind of considered unusable space, and so we, you know, would commonly fill in these places, you know, and so the loss of habitat was also a factor in all of this. So by 1933, there was only about 70 known trumpeter swans, at least, and I emphasize known, in North America. And most of these swans were located in the greater Yellowstone ecosystem. And unfortunately, because this decline of the species happened so long ago and so quickly, we really only have a kind of not a complete understanding of their historic range. So parts of their ranges still remain unknown today, and will continue to be that way. And maybe the birds themselves will show us over time. So focusing on Yellowstone itself here, the first reported swans were from the Washburn, Langford, and Doane expedition prior to park establishment in 1870. And by the 1880s, reports of swans in Yellowstone, this is after the establishment of the park, reports were described as abundant in places like Yellowstone Lake. However, by the 1890s, we started to see these, or if you go back into the reports of swans, they were seeing much less of them. So the reporting began to decline. And I think overall, this is somewhat you know, in hindsight, foreshadowing a little bit of how swans in Yellowstone are likely were linked to swans outside of the park as well. So in 1933, when only 70 known swans were located in North America, 27 adults, and so that's your actual population. You know, young birds that we refer to as cygnets have not been recruited into a population. So really what's showing you your status of your population is that white bird population, those adults. And there's about 27 of those located in Yellowstone National Park. So a pretty substantial number given relative to 70 total birds. And during this time, you know, it was becoming greater and greater knowledge that trumpeter swans were reaching these near extinction levels. And so George Melendez Wright, who was the National Park Service's first wildlife biologist, came to Yellowstone to try to conduct a study on swans. And within the park, looked at areas like an area we call the Turn Lake Complex, where it's an interior portion of the park, really extensive wetland, as well as some areas to the north, like the Trumpeter Lake Complex. He made various observations of otters and ravens making attempts to scavenge eggs from nests and so forth. But he documented them in the park as well as some areas outside the park. With this study he did shortly after that, he and the current superintendent of the time, as well as others, decided to focus on the GYE as the center of recovery for this species. And so at that time in 1935, they established Red Rock Lakes National Wildlife Refuge, and that's just west of Yellowstone, and for the sole purpose of at the time of providing ideal lake place for swans to breed and to hopefully start to fill back in some of the missing areas where swans previously had been. So now, by jumping forward in time, about approximately 33 years later, only about 3,700 known swans were known to exist across North America, and most of those were from previously unknown populations in Alaska and Canada. So, despite us knowing about 70 in the 30s, there were more swans out there, but nonetheless, still highly reduced from historic numbers. Now, at the same time, within the GYE, we had approximately 600. So, I think, 30 years increasing from 7,600, progress was definitely being made, and that's a positive sign of what they were trying to, what their goals were when they established Red Rock Lakes and the GYE as that center of recovery. So to dive into Yellowstone data specific, over here on the right, I have just a graph of adult swan abundance as well as cygnet totals per year from 1931 through 2023. So years down there on what we call the x-axis, abundance is there on the vertical, on the y-axis. And we tend to refer to the 1930s and 1950s as the Yellowstone National Park population heyday. And so you can see there at 1931, some of our earliest count, had relatively no numbers, but as you see that trend just really shot up there. And between that time that we saw numbers fluctuate between the 30 and 80 individuals, and I want to point out that there's multiple breeding territories at the time, but a majority of the territories were less productive. There was 11 territories that would tend to produce the most cygnets, and identifying kind of key areas of probably higher habitat quality that were really kind of likely driving the population growth, putting more cygnets out on the landscape that hopefully eventually become recruited into the population and become breeders themselves. So by 1961, we had about 70 adult swans in the park. So that's your breeding population plus birds that are just occupying portions of the park. But that was kind of a high point for adult swans there. However, that was also unknown at the time, the start of what became around a 50-year decline. And so you can see on the figure on the right here, now we've moved forward to 1986. And at that time, there was about 24 adults left in the park. And so within about a 30-year period, we decreased by significantly from 70 to 24. And at this time, this was the park's first kind of, hey, maybe we should think about doing something here. And so at that time, what they decided to do was install nesting platforms. And we'll get back into nesting platforms in a moment, but they serve multiple purposes. They allow for birds to move off shores. They deal with fluctuating water levels, as well as providing some safety from scavengers and predators and so forth. So jumping forward again a little bit more here, by 2009 to 2010, we reached a low count of 2 to 4 white birds. So in 2009, between 2009 and 2010, we had I think one count was 2, one count was 3. We presumed 4, I think, because of cloud cover. Nonetheless, we were right there at the edge of losing swans in Yellowstone. And so at that time, the question is, do we need to take action? And not knowing why this happened, that was one of the main questions at the time. And this really fell on Doug Smith, because he had recently taken over the program with only a few years earlier. And so this fell right in his lap as, a question of what we do. So Doug in 2011 organized a workshop, and he pulled together state and federal agencies, individuals, nonprofit individuals. Ruth Shea, the late Ruth Shea, was who did her graduate work on swans in Yellowstone, was one of the strong advocates for and of swan preservation in this region and elsewhere as well. And so all these people came together, and the goal was to try to help guide what kind of management could be put forth, as well as explore hypotheses related to what was causing this decline, or what had caused this decline, I should say. And so some of these hypotheses revolved around habitat degradation. So Yellowstone is, we're not developing Yellowstone on average. I mean, maybe there's a few developed areas within the park, but it's left alone. So the changes that we see here are typically more natural, whether it be fire or something like, climate change, which encompasses fire, encompasses warming climate, encompasses drying things. So we've seen this. We've seen areas where swans historically occurred that are now lakes that in some years may persist, and some years may completely dry up. And so these are areas where swans were and no longer are. And so it fit right in with a possible cause here. Another hypothesis revolved around decreased immigration from outside of the park. This is something I'll get into a little bit more about, this connection with areas outside of Yellowstone, and how what we see here really kind of related to what outside the park. Just predator recovery as a whole, like when we started looking at swans here, bears were low. We had removed wolves. Coyote numbers were really unknown. Cougars were gone, and so forth. So with this decline, really correlates really well with the recovery of all these predators. The reintroduction of wolves, and the increase of grizzly bears and so forth. Human disturbance also fit right in with a potential cause. At this, we went from I should just point out that the visitors have only steadily increased over time, and even today now we're exceeding 4 million visitors every year, and all this, and the bulk of that visitation happens during the breeding season. So in the middle of winter, when swans are floating around and all that, we barely have visitors, but come the breeding season is when all the visitors come too. And another hypothesis revolved around genetic depression. So the population had reached such low levels that it was thought that potentially that swans had kind of reached somewhat of maybe of a bottleneck where that was limiting the health of the population. So I guess let me back up here. The one thing I want to say about all these hypotheses is that at this workshop, none of these really nobody could really land on any one of these. And so there was no consensus on how any one of these may have been a major factor in this decline. And so they kind of landed at this, that the consensus really ended up being that it was likely a multifaceted situation where one of these, all of these, something else we unaccounted for, all may have played a factor in this decline. So, but by the end of this, the goal was at this point was, okay, we don't know what caused this decline, but if we were to lose all these birds prior to understanding what's causing this decline, it may be very, very difficult to get them back. And so the primary goal was to increase the number of territorial pairs, as well as increase production of young. So what that looked like was we took on different management actions. And so one of the first things we did was to revisit what would have been done in 86 by deploying these floating nest platforms. And so, as I said, these allow for fluctuating with water levels. They move birds away from the shoreline where predators are going. They move birds away from the shoreline where let's say something like a fisherman's moving. All, human disturbance, predators, climate related issues. These platforms definitely serve multiple purpose for us. And so in 2011, we deployed this platform at Grebe Lake, and by 2012, the very next year, the birds took to it. And that was the first year since 1952 that territory, that occupied territory, since that it had never gone unoccupied as far as I know, they hatched out their first cygnets that year. So it was a really nice, neat thing to see the effect, so early in this implementation of a management action, to see the a platform work like that. Now in 2016, we deployed a platform at Swan Lake, and so this is more at the northern end of the park, and a pair of swans had showed up there, and by 2019 we saw the first cygnets produced since 1966 at Swan Lake. And so these swans at Swan Lake used the platform, but they also did use the shoreline as well. And there was some predation that occurred there as well. But nonetheless, providing these safe nesting areas, or safer nesting areas for these birds, has overall been successful for us. So to address human disturbance, we take into consideration some of the lakes that get higher visitation. Some of these swans are very remote, whereas some of these swans are using areas that are very popular to visitors. And so this map I have here on the right of Riddle Lake, the Riddle Lake Swan Closure here, this area, what the unique thing about this area is closed until the middle of July. Because of it's considered a bear management area here in the park. We have bear management areas dispersed throughout the park for various reasons. And so come July 15th, this opens. Now these swans have been in there at that lake since now, essentially. As soon as ice off, the birds show up there. They nest, they hatch their young, they're on the water, and long before anybody ever shows up there. And so these birds in particular show a very obvious response to the presence of people. And so I have this image here to kind of divide out. So Grebe Lake at the top there, Riddle Lake at the bottom. And these are just images of swans with their cygnets. And so a common thing we see here is at Grebe Lake, which is visited by people throughout the year, there's a partial closure there for nesting, but a whole portion of the lake is still open for fishing and so forth. These birds, give space to their young. We commonly see this. We don't see them, see much fear. That a lot of times they'll be near the shore, not far from where you are, maybe. And so completely opposite story at Riddle Lake, where that bear management area is. And you can see this image at the bottom where the cygnets are right there next to that, next to that adult. And that's a common scene we see here. And so what happens at Riddle Lake when they open that up in July, historically, when they open that up at July 15th, it's a popular fishing lake. It's a beautiful lake, but it's also one of the best areas of swan habitat in the park. And what we'd see is people come to the lake, swans move away from the shoreline where most of the forage is located, move out to the middle of the lake, become more vulnerable, and things like this happen. So Doug took this photo in 2013 of the two adults out in the middle of the lake with feathers scattered around in a floating cygnet there. And at the same time, this bald eagle on the left here was perched nearby, drying its wings. And so it's presumed that this bird, this adult, came in and made a move on that young cygnet. Now it's unknown if it came back and retrieved it, likely did. But it is presumed, more because it wasn't observed, but everything like that happening at once really suggests that bald did that. And what we would see is we'd see that over and over again from year to year. We'd see them produce, say, 4 cygnets, and by late summer they're down to 1 or none. And so we decided at that point that it really had to do with them moving into that vulnerable area. Whereas if they're foraging like they normally would be along the edges, they're much more protected portions of the area to protect themselves from a predator like a bald eagle. So we decided to make the move that the Riddle Lake be closed all the way through the breeding season until these young were close to fledging. And that's semi-controversial for people that love to visit Riddle Lake, but it showed some success in them at least fledging at least 1 young in a lot of years. Another thing we do is and we haven't done this much, but we've also done grafting. And this is where and so the purpose of grafting is, one, it really strongly increases the probability of swans successfully fledging their young, whereas that means actually having them leave the lake come fall. But how this is done is we got Bill Long from the Wyoming Wetland Society there in these photos, and he approaches the nest when they're on eggs, removes the eggs, puts in dummy wooden eggs, and we bring these eggs back and hatch them out in captivity. Within 24 hours, these young or other young are brought back to this nest. And I say the other young because sometimes we introduce other young for the purpose of increasing the genetic diversity. And so, as I said before, you by doing that, it's in theory strengthening the overall health of the population. And if we don't bring back the eggs that came from the nest, they're released later, which I'll cover here in a moment. So as you see in that upper right photo there, around 1 day, less than 1 day old chicks are brought back. We head back out to the nest, take out the dummy eggs, and put those chicks in. And really a key here is to not let these young ones imprint on you. And so there's as you're hiking out to the lake, you're making the sounds of trumpeter swans, and just give them that comfort. And they really are meant to just be put in the nest and have them see those adults as soon as possible for that key imprint period. So another thing we do is release swans. And so between 2013 and 2023, we've released 64 cygnets, and these cygnets are approximately 100 days old. These are local. I say local as in they're genetically related to the GYE population. And they're brought at this age because this is prior to them fledging. So they're near fledging age now. They've never flown before. Our most common release site is in Hayden Valley, in the central portion of the park on the Yellowstone River. This is one of the key reasons we release here is this is a known congregation point for swans, whether they be swans from outside the area, for swans that are leaving their territories in the park because their lakes are freezing up and they move here. This area of the river typically doesn't freeze over completely. And so by fall, there can be hundreds of swans on the Yellowstone River at this time. And so we release these birds every year, and we've been doing that since 2013. And I can say that like this has been, and I'll show you for various reasons why this has been successful, but we know for a fact that some of these swans occupy some previously vacated territories. The Swan Lake territory, which I mentioned, was reestablished by released swans. The current birds at Grebe Lake, I can tell you that one of those birds was one of our 2013 releases. So not only has it been recruited into the population, but it's survived the last 10 years, which is great to see. So overall, this has been a very or I should say, so far a promising method of management to try to bolster the numbers of swans in the park. So just a kind of a quick side note to our releases. So this year in September, we released 8 cygnets. Now, come November, I think we lost. Well, one of them was lost pretty soon. Likely didn't make it, which is not an uncommon thing for young birds to experience. But 7 of these cygnets were observed on the 9th of November. Now, what was interesting, and this was thanks to Trumpeter Watch and the Trumpeter Swan Society contacting us, was that 6 of these cygnets were observed over 1,100 miles away in Kansas in late February. And so, you know, just getting these little glimpses of what these migrations from Yellowstone could look like is a really cool kind of bit of the story. And we're able to identify these birds because we one band them with a common metal band that you band all birds with, issued by the USGS, as well as visual identification bands, which are yellow and black. So yellow bands with black writing. And so you can read those typically with spotting scopes while birds are feeding. And so we were able to get this report, and now we're just kind of waiting to see if they show back up. And we really hope we see them here and maybe try to further understand this pathway that they took. And finally, kind of the last thing, and really the long-term thing we've always done is to monitor territory occupancy and reproduction. And so it's a goal for us to get to territories every year, see if they're reproducing, some of these territories we visit by foot, some of these territories we visit by the air. Nice conspicuous bird. So flying and looking for a massive nest and a big white bird isn't the most difficult thing, thankfully. And so this has been something that's, we're closing in on 100 years of this kind of data record. So that's kind of a really amazing thing to be part of at this point, is to have a data set that's approaching that 100-year mark. So this year in Yellowstone, so we had 5 territorial pairs initiate nesting. And so, if you think back just to 2011, where we had only 2 pairs left in the park, none of which were being successful. This year we had 5 territories initiate, which was, I wish I could give you the date of the last time we had 5 pairs that bred. Maybe Doug can jump in at the end here and maybe give us a little background there if he has that number. But I can say that 4 of these 5 pairs hatched out 12 cygnets onto the water. Unfortunately, only 1 pair successfully fledged 3 cygnets. Now, a lot of these birds are they're newly mated, and just like anybody, you got to learn how to be good parents, and it may be that, it may be habitat itself. It's hard to know, but to kind of give you an idea of what was successful, or where this line laid out this year. Grebe Lake, which in a lot of years these days does breed, hatched out 3 cygnets, but unfortunately did not fledge any of those. Riddle Lake, which had not bred since 2016, after I believe it was a female was lost there, I think due to predation. This was the first year that they bred since 2016. So to see zero cygnets hatched isn't too surprising. That's likely the pair's first attempt at ever to breed. Swan Lake, which has over the last, since 2019, has really proven to be a good territory, hatched out 4 cygnets, and they're the ones that fledged out the 3. Now we're seeing more and more swans in the southwest corner of Yellowstone, which is a very wet portion of the park. It makes sense. It fits well with kind of how we associate swan habitat. And so we had 4 cygnets hatch out there. Unfortunately, not fledged, as well as Cygnet Lakes, which is really kind of part of the overall Grebe Lake complex within the same region there. So very exciting to see this many birds breed this year, and fingers crossed that we see this many or more breed next year. And I say more because one thing we saw was, if we throughout the summer we're documenting where else we see birds. So Wolf Lake, which is the neighboring lake to Grebe, we commonly see swans using some, individuals or pairs using some of these other lakes near Grebe Lake. We would see one there. Lewis Lake, we had a bird on that on Lewis Lake. This is a historic territory that hasn't been occupied in a long, long time. So just even seeing a swan on Lewis Lake is a cool thing to see. If they can be there again one day, that'd be great. So an area where we commonly see them is in the south, what we call the southeast arm of Yellowstone Lake. The Yellowstone River Delta area. There's been a pair down there for a number of years. We have never detected breeding yet, but nonetheless, we see a pair there. It sure does seem like we have an occupied potential occupied territory in that region of the park. We had Delusion Lake, which is adjacent to Yellowstone Lake. We had a pair there. Robinson Lake, which is in the more southwest corner of the park. We observed a pair there. These are all non-breeders, but still paired birds. In an additional pair in the Beckler area, as well as a single bird floating around. The Grizzly Lake area, which is more northern Yellowstone, we commonly would see a pair within the complex of lakes there, as well as I would see a group of four birds floating around between lakes as well. And I put this up here, I mentioned the more productive territories, and I mentioned it earlier, and I just want to throw up this is 10 of those 11, and just to kind of give you an idea of kind of how it kind of looks when we think about what are these productive territories, and what has been their persistence on the landscape. And you can see that Riddle Lake by far and away, looking at it looks great, and historically has really been one of the primary drivers of production in Yellowstone. Turn Lake, which is to this day still looks like a really ideal place. Unfortunately, by 1988 has not bred since. No swans have bred there since 1988. In fact, we rarely see swans there now. It was a release site. In fact, one of the birds that were released there in 2013 are one of the birds that breed at Grebe. Trumpeter Lake is historically a really good spot, but this is where George Melendez Wright, one of the areas he studied the birds, and two, it's the area where we in some years see the lakes dry up, and there's still some of the main lakes that hold water year round, and it's potential that they can pull it off there, but swans have not returned to Trumpeter Lakes. Grebe Lake obviously fits into the history here, even though we had a big gap in time between any kind of successful breeding. They still were one of the primary producers. And the last one I want to point out real quick is Robinson Lake there, because that's a historic territory that was productive, and we're seeing a pair there now. And so that's another one of those fingers crossed type of things where we're really hoping that when you see these historic, highly productive territories with pairs on them, I'm hoping that's a positive sign of what our management is actually kind of making a difference here. So we've also facilitated some research here in Yellowstone, and it has revolved around why did swans decline in Yellowstone. And so Laura Cockrell in 2014, she finished her graduate work in 2014, and her work focused on looking at using what we call remote sense data, so satellite imagery data and things like that, to kind of assess over time how the wetland resources may influence the occupation and breeding status of swans. And so overall, the findings were inconclusive, but her work did support what previous research had shown about that cool, wet springs are generally bad for nesting. And that's something I don't know if we're generally seeing an increase of that, but it's fairly common that we're seeing pretty wet and cold springs here. In fact, we're kind of going through that phase right now. We had a very mild winter, and spring comes, and next thing you know, we're getting rain and cold days and over again. So, it's still early, but that's something we're seeing. And another thing that her research supported was that overall larger wetlands tend to increase site occupancy. And so these were things that her research supported, but trying to dig down to what that specific reason for decline was in Yellowstone really was missed in this research, unfortunately. Now, thanks to the Trumpeter Swan Society, amongst others, another research project that was completed in 2021 by Evan Shields the goal again was to try to use existing data sets, one being our swan counts, as well as what other data sets on predators, data sets on visitation, on weather variations, to look at how that might have influenced decline. And unfortunately, we really didn't get at a solid understanding of what caused the decline. What best was understood from Evan's study was that overall, and supports what I said earlier, overall, when abundance outside of Yellowstone National Park, so in particular Red Rock Lakes, when swans were at higher numbers there, it was indicative of better years in Yellowstone. And so really, once again, showing that relationship and that emigration connection to swans outside of the park. Now, a lot of these variables that he looked at in his analysis, a lot of them were correlated, and so it's really difficult to discern what's going on when you have human visitation and predators all increasing at the same time. And so, but his research did loosely support that predators and human disturbance could be playing a factor in this decline. However, in the end, we really still kind of are at this point of not truly understanding the decline. So, to jump forward to this figure again, now complete through 2023. So this last year, September 28th, I did our autumn survey. This is a survey that happens every year. It's an aerial survey, and we counted for the second year in a row. We counted 26 white birds. We observed the 3 cygnets that Swan Lake produced, as well as the 7 cygnets that we released earlier that month. And you can see there that we've really brought up these numbers significantly, and seeing these pairs occupying previously vacated territories, having 5 breeding territories this year, all are positive signs of our management and what we're doing here. So we're back up at numbers that precede, that are above what we were seeing in the late 90s. So as we're still searching for this cause, I think that we've done the right thing in trying to preserve the presence of swans here in Yellowstone. So looking forward, overall future of birds in Yellowstone and of trumpeter swans in Yellowstone, we still, I still think, but it still is a question that this decline likely is a multifaceted problem, and we likely will never see those historic levels again. I mean, I'm not going to say that concretely by any means, but if it is human disturbance, that's not going away. Predators aren't going away. That there's various reasons why we may not expect to see that, but that's okay. What you want to ideally achieve is a self-sustaining local population. As I said earlier, we're seeing these positive results from these management actions that are kind of at least helping us build this population up and potentially, by itself reestablish a self-sustaining population. 5 breeding pairs, as I said, this last year here. The birds we're releasing are some of these birds are being recruited, as I said, into the population, which is also very good to see. They're not just dying, they're not just flying, they're not just migrating north with Canadian birds that from Canada or so forth. They're sticking around, and that's signs that the habitat may still be reliable enough for them to want to be here and to want to breed. As I mentioned a minute ago, that additional, we're still, and these additional pairs are another promising look at birds that could easily become breeding birds. And our goal really is in this portion of our management is to get to 5 to 6 breeding pairs of breeding birds that are being successful on a near annual basis, if give or take, I should say. And if this management alone were to be successful, that's really kind of our mark currently of what would be ideal. As I mentioned, high of 26 birds this year, and that was the last 2 years in a row. So, we'll see what happens this year come September, but I'm hoping numbers are up or at least stable. Unfortunately, reproduction is still low, but this one could be habitat related. It could be, as I mentioned earlier, inexperience by these younger birds that are representing most of the population currently. What really the kind of one of the last studies that I really think is missing from this and potentially can indirectly explain some of this decline potentially is a habitat study. So and when I say habitat study, a much more fine scale understanding of the resources available to these birds at these local areas. So how do the resources compare within the park where swans are currently occupying versus areas that were historically occupied, as well as how the habitat in the park compares to, so the resource, I should say the resources, like, so the food resources and so forth, how that compares to areas outside the park where swans are doing better than what we see in Yellowstone. So this is really something we hope to get off the ground in the next few years here. I think it's a real big missing part of the question of why swans have declined in Yellowstone. And so, given like the lack of this, this study not happening yet, it begs the question of if should swans remain in Yellowstone if perpetual management is needed. And it's the Park Service isn't really in the business of trying to correct natural declines. And so if this really was something that is just naturally occurring, at a certain point, we likely need to step back and let the swans take the wheel on this and see what they can do. I think something like, something to evaluate the resources that are available to these birds is a big part of that. And so, we're not pulling back from management just yet, but that's something that we have to keep in mind always, is that you're not really restoring a population if it requires this year in, year out management for the species. So with that, actually, before I jump to the questions, I wanted to invite Doug to, if I missed anything, if there's anything he wants to point out, or any key points that he wants to say about this. I mean, Doug really took a big lead on this for a lot of years, and being a bit, and I don't know if you guys know who Doug Smith is, but very well known for wolf work in Yellowstone. And so for him to dive so deep into swans was a really generous move on his part. So Doug, do you have anything to say?
I don't. I thought it was an excellent talk. Let me underscore that Dave and I've worked together a long time on raptors and songbirds. So I'm really impressed at his knowledge that he's acquired on water birds. That was an impressive talk. I will add one thing for emphasis, because Dave really was thorough and he covered so much. But I want to underscore the importance of management action being allowed in a national park setting. He covered this, but especially the last point under the future that's still on your screen. But in general, the National Park Service policy is hands off. It's, we really only have two objectives, which is visitor enjoyment and preservation. And preservation is no use. And it's not conservation, which is sustainable management in perpetuity. But the Park Service really likes just to allow natural conditions to occur. So when you intervene, like wolf reintroduction or swan nest platforms or swan reintroduction, it's because you've identified that the cause of the decline is due to human intervention. Now, the National Park Service doesn't have a great answer when it comes to climate change, because they feel like, well, it's kind of holding up a candle in a hurricane. There's not much you can do. But given that swan workshop in 2011, we were at a conundrum, one, not knowing why swans are declining, and two, there was no consensus on management action. So the Park Service made an exception for management action, and that is rare. Dave covered that. So this is just more of a point of emphasis rather than a new point. But that's all I have to add to what I thought was a great talk. Thanks, Dave.
Right on. Well, Doug and I are happy to answer any questions for you guys.
Well, this is Margaret, and thanks both of you. It was a wonderful presentation, and as always, I learned a lot. And I do have a question, and hopefully folks out there will, put your questions in the Q&A box. Of the swans that are now occurring within the park that you see, are most of them marked where they've been released, or are you seeing some unmarked birds that don't have leg bands or whatever that might be coming from other areas? I'm curious about that.
So there's It's a mix. There's actually quite a few that are unmarked, and some of them, I'm not used to the bands coming off, but I think with the freezing conditions that these birds experience, sometimes bands actually do come off of these birds. But from my impression, we're definitely seeing birds from outside areas using the park. So some of the and some of these birds are so remote that we just can't get in close enough a lot of times to actually see the legs of all these birds, because we only are marking the legs only. So they need to be typically feeding or on shore to see those.
Okay, great. And Marianne, did you want to ask some of the questions that have come in, and hopefully people will put their questions in the Q&A box. Marianne?
Thank you, Margaret. Sure, we've had a few questions come in. Please feel free to enter your questions in the Q&A box. I see a few more coming in. Dave and Douglas, the first question may have been covered a little bit, but perhaps you can go into it in a little bit more detail from Jerry. Do wolf populations affect trumpeter swan populations?
Oh, wow. Okay. I was going to defer to Dave on most questions because of the excellent presentation, but with the word wolf in it, I guess that's for me. Wolves do occasionally predate trumpeter swans. It's uncommon, and we don't have evidence that that is the cause for the decline. Dave mentioned Evan Shields' study, which the Trumpeter Swan Society supported. Evan went to Montana State, and during that period when swans were doing very well in Yellowstone, there were no wolves. And of course, wolves were introduced 30 years ago, mid-90s. And predation on trumpeter swans has been documented, as has coyotes. And the previous bird program manager, Terry McEnany, hypothesized that canid predation may be involved in the decline, but we concluded that it happens so infrequently, and a lot of times in the winter when there's a lot of migrants coming into the park, so it's not the breeders, that it was not having an effect.
Thank you. And then just another question while we're following up on the last topic that you had before we ended the presentation. Are there any other National Park Service locations that have trumpeter swan management?
So Dave just texted me saying that his internet connection dropped. A Grand Teton right south of us is also kind of part of our working group on swans. So the greater Yellowstone Swan Working Group, Grand Teton, is involved with that. I'm not, outside of that, familiar with any other national parks. I hesitate to say that because there's probably someplace that they are working on them. But as Dave mentioned, a big issue with swans in the continental United States, not so much Canada and Alaska, which tends to be more of a stronghold. But no one really knew. Dave's back up, but they're spotty. Their original distribution was never really well documented because swans mortality began in the fur trade in the 1700s. So a lot of parks, Dave, the question deals with the other parks that have swan programs, and Grand Teton for sure does because they're in the GYE. But during my tenure in Yellowstone, I really didn't communicate with other national parks about swans. Dave, can you add to that?
I didn't hear the initial question, but I will say
what other national parks are working with swans?
Yeah, I mean, well, so Teton has not had any nesting swans for some time, I believe. And I actually was recently talking with John Stevenson, with Teton about a potential habitat study down the line here, and he does have a desire to participate in that as well. So I think that would be a cool thing to bring in, considering we're all connected here, and to assess beyond the boundaries of Yellowstone, I think is key to understanding kind of the conditions of this place. But other than that, that's the most I've communicated with anybody outside of Yellowstone so far. Well, besides our working group, obviously.
Here's another question. Are the trumpeter swans in Yellowstone inbred compared to other populations, such as in Canada?
I can Doug can probably answer a little bit. I'll briefly say because I did mention genetic you know genetic concerns there. From what I know, the testing show that they actually aren't inbred. They actually, though not. Well, actually, Doug, do you want to just jump on? You can probably explain this better. Essentially, doesn't appear to be one of the reasons for decline. But go ahead, Doug.
No, I think that's a fine job, Dave. I forget her name. There was a paper, a woman, Margaret will probably remember it, but did an analysis of the genetics of the Rocky Mountain pipe. Actually, all three. There's three populations of trumpeter swans: the Pacific, the Rocky Mountain, and the Mississippi populations, and they largely hold to their own kind of geographic regions. But despite that, none of them showed signs of genetic depression. I think is the Sarah McCants published that in a peer-reviewed publication. So we eliminated genetic depression as a possibility for the decline. And to do the reintroduction in Yellowstone, the sideboards by management where we had to use the greater Yellowstone birds delivered to us by Wyoming Wetland Society, Bill Long. And in retrospect, that might not have been, we could discuss if that's a good decision or not, because having birds from other areas might have increased genetic connectivity. And that's an open question. But nonetheless, genetic depression was not found by Sarah in her peer-reviewed publication.
Great, thank you. We did have someone listening who's asked a few of the questions about the genetic studies, and I think you've answered most of them. One, there's one more about is the gradual decline of swans numbers typical to island biogeography where there is not enough connectivity for incoming birds. So the stochastic events like disease, fire, human poaching, or harassment lead to local extirpation.
There's a lot there. I mean, I think that like any there's always that critical level of a population, whether it be we think about a carrying capacity and going above or below that and how that might influence the population. There's also what we call an Lee effect, which is if a population reaches a certain level, it can't sustain. And so, I think the passenger pigeon is the primary, like, greatest example of that. Once the most abundant bird in maybe the world, and reached at a certain point, it was being harvested, being killed by people, but that wasn't the final draw. It was that the population had reached a too low of a level, and that's where it crashed. So it's possible that the having this small area of birds. Now we see influxes of migrants come in here. They all commingle with each other, but the migrants return, and potentially some of our birds leave and become migrants. It's hard to, some of that stuff's being more recently unraveled. But yeah, I really can't tell you for sure if the island effect of our local population here had any cause for decline. Doug, you have anything to say about that?
Nope, can't add to that. Thanks, Dave.
Okay.
Yep.
Thank you both. So let's switch topics. We have a question about when you've released the fledgling cygnets into the park. Have you had any concerns about releasing them into a sink population? And then following that, is there any habitat? Would you be able to do any habitat alterations? Understanding that that would need to align with the national parks hands-on, hands-off mandate.
Yes, restoration. I mean, unless we had grossly affected a wetland, and I don't ever foresee us making any kind of wetland restoration efforts here. What was the I lost my the releases. What was the first part of that?
Source sink dynamic.
Oh
What
yeah.
is Yellowstone?
I
Yeah.
mean, these birds are local to this region. You know, they're local to this region. So the goal is to see if this effort will increase the number of birds and create a sustainable breeding population. So, you know, without sounding, I guess, not caring about these release birds, that we don't know if this is a sink. We don't know if that's the situation. And so, I mean, to get at that requires a lot more study. So it's not really, on the top of our heads right now, if that's what we're doing, is putting these birds into a basically a bit of a trap or a sink, whatever you want to call it.
I'll add to that by saying that Yellowstone is essentially a high elevation plateau with a very short breeding season. And trumpeter swans have maybe the largest time period of any North American bird. I guess the other bird to look at would be the California condor, maybe longer. But from egg laying to fledging is about 110 to 120 days. That's incredibly long for a bird in a temperate habitat. And so if anything happens at the beginning or the end of that period, like Swan Lake, which Dave so nicely described, there's early freeze up. The cygnets can't fly. They're standing on top of the ice, and bald eagles are dive bombing them. And so if that beginning or end, it changes at all. And I think that's been a decades long issue for Yellowstone. So there is a hypothesis that it is marginal habitat, and with climate change, you might be tipping it more towards a sink than towards a source. But certainly Red Rocks has been a long-term source. So there is an argument for this person's question that Yellowstone is a sink, but we don't have enough data to really say.
Are there wetlands outside Yellowstone that could be used or that should be conserved or protected to increase connectivity to other non-migratory swan populations?
There's lots of wetlands that surround Yellowstone, and there's actually some active restoration projects occurring in some of these areas as well. So we have a Greater Yellowstone Ecosystem Trumpeter Swan working group, and so that group addresses areas that are potentially ideal for restoration for various reasons. And so there's wetlands that surround Yellowstone that are occupied by swans that are doing well, and there's also areas that have been identified as potential restoration sites for swans, based on the conditions that are observed there. Yeah.
Right. And one last question, since the birds, the overall population, the wintering population has increased tremendously over the past 15 years, where are the swans coming from, since they're not just being born, they're not just the local population?
I mean, so I haven't been involved in any of the tracking work that's gone on, so other people can answer that more clearly. I mean, Canada for sure, probably Alaska, but yeah, I mean, I think that I mean, that's about as far as I can go with that. I mean, as I said, that's all like information that's like more recently being revealed through the use of more fine scale tracking with GPS transmitters and so forth. Doug,
The only thing I'll add to that is Dave mentioned the park's annual fall count, late September. Historically, we did a winter count. And so I did that for a decade, and we would get 300 to 500 birds in the park in the winter. So that was dramatically different than the roughly mid-20s that Dave counted last 2023. And as he mentioned, a lot of those birds we didn't get, they weren't marked. I did the survey from an airplane, so you can't tell anyway, but it's clearly an influx of birds that winter in the park from Canada and Alaska. That survey's been discontinued because the working group that Dave mentioned felt it doesn't lead to any management action or any understanding of population dynamics for the resident birds. So although I think that was a valuable survey, it gave you information on year-to-year fluctuations in wintering birds. It was discontinued. It cost a lot of money because it did not lead to understanding or management action.
Great, thank you.
When I went to observe the cygnets out on the Yellowstone River in November this last year, there was probably 100 and I think I counted them. I don't have the number in front of me. Probably 170 swans on the river with those cygnets and stuff. And so, yeah, we see. I mean, where they're coming from exactly, but they're using this area quite a bit in the wintertime.
Great, thank you. Those are all of our questions, so I'll turn it back over to you, Margaret.
Well, thank you everyone for attending, and my special thanks to Dave and Doug for making this wonderful presentation. After I end the recording or after I end the webinar, you'll get a brief survey that'll pop up. I hope you'll fill it out, and the recording of this will come out through Zoom to everyone who registered in a couple of days. So it's been a great pleasure to have you here, and we hope to see you at another webinar. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, guys.